Hello, I hope everybody had a good week and a great weekend. I am grading material and going through, and I'm really happy with what I'm seeing. And people are doing an excellent job in uh, communicating the things that they're discovering. Thank you very much. I have put up the titles for each of the remaining modules throughout the rest of the term. And I'm thinking that if you want to cover one of those with one of your projects, you just need to tie it into what the title of the module suggests until I open it up. And if it's not quite the same as the direction I take it, that's fine. You're doing the best you can with the material that you've got. One of the ongoing concerns that I have with this course is we have this default when we talk about gender and art, we're usually talking about, or we're assuming the male gaze, and we're talking about, well, I say we, and it's, it doesn't really matter who you are. It seems to me that art history generally is a field that assumes a male gaze, and so we've got to work ourselves, we've got to work against that presupposition a little bit. But and I am sorry, most of what I'm doing is just trying to share how gender roles in art production and art subject matter have been communicated. And a lot of that comes down to focusing on how particularly women fit into the art world. I wish there was a different way of doing this that I knew. And if anybody can suggest anything, that would be great. But until then, that's pretty much the direction I'm going to be taking, trying to share things that I find regarding women's roles as subject matter and art production, art producers, how women's roles may fit or go against what we might expect out of whatever subject matter that we're looking at. One of the things that I'm finding out that I think is really interesting, I don't know if you remember, one of the very early modules that we talked about was prehistoric art and myth, stories about time before time. And remember that myth is not fantasy. Myth is, the word itself means spoken truth. So myth itself is how people navigate their experience with the universe, their experience with the world around them. And myth becomes, in essence, more true than true, because it's the lens through which people see truth. When we look at myth from many different cultures, it seems that gender, from our expectations, is a bit more fluid than what we would expect. And I talk about that, and I have a video that I linked to in that first module, which I'll link to that page again so you guys can revisit that video. I think that that's a really good video that introduces this whole idea. Our perspective, and I'm saying our as basically general members of Western American culture, essentially. Regardless of where we fit individually, the culture as a whole does seem to have these rather specific expectations for not only gender, but what gender does, how gender is expressed, how gender wears its clothing, essentially. And whether or not individually we might agree with that, or even find ourselves connected to that, we need to be aware that that is an example of cultural momentum that we need to be aware of. So when we examine other cultures, when we find articles and videos that relate to discussions on how gender is expressed in different cultures and different time periods. When it is produced by and for a Western audience, for the most part, it is going to be either directly discussing those cultural gender expectations, or it's going to be pushing against them. But on some level, it's going to be reacting to them and being aware of them. So just be aware of that as a framework for as we move forward. My in my family, there are some individuals from my second wife was from the continent of Africa, and so I have a rather personal connection with this week's module. One of the things that we discover very quickly is that the continent of Africa has between 54 and 56 countries, depending on if you include principal island nations around it. And the continent itself has housed human beings since before they became human beings. I mean, the Human Genome Project announced several years ago that the first humans resembling us, first modern humans, did come from Africa. And the oldest cultures in the world have their start in Africa. The human presence has been there between 250 and 300,000 years ago. So for an extraordinarily long time. There are over 3,000 ethnicities present on the continent, over 2,000 languages present on the continent. That's just today. Evidence of history, there are thousands of more languages and ways to communicate that have been invented and used down through the centuries. And a lot of those have died, just either because people shift and move around and change, or as a direct result of the impact of colonialism. Cultures hundreds, centuries ago in the continent of Africa had hot and cold running water. There are astonishing amounts of artifacts that demonstrate human habitation. Every once in a while, a story comes out about people in gold or diamond mines that find a shaft that is impressively deep in the earth, but it was worked before by people well before the advent of iron tools. So there's a lot of amazing stuff. The Nubian engineers taught the Egyptians, it looks like, from the archaeological record. Nubian engineers taught the Egyptians how to build pyramids. And there's just a fantastic wealth culturally and socially and artistically that comes from just that wealth of intermeshed cultures and identities that really makes up this concept of Africa that we have. I remember being a young man and rather startled when somebody talked about the flag of Africa, and it was startling to me because that's like saying, the flag of South America or the flag of Europe, or it used to be like that. I guess with the European Union, that's changing. But there's such a diversity of cultures that it is hard to easily wrap our heads around what's going on. And so what I'm doing, I'm just kind of picking and choosing different things that I think are of interest. But please understand, this just represents a tiny, tiny, tiny fingernails width slice of the historical presence of human activity on the continent. I read several years ago that there is more genetic diversity within the humans in the continent of Africa than there is in the rest of the world put together. traditionally, I found some really cool stuff to share with you guys. Traditionally, gender roles in Africa bear a relationship to what we are comfortable with in somehow in production and other things, but not all the time. And I'll give some examples. We expect that there is going to be, I say we, general Western culture expects that, for example, kingship passes down through the oldest male heir. And that's not always true in Africa. There's many examples where cultures will be, where the leader will be decided by a council of women, will be decided by the genetic link to a woman in power. Sometimes the leaders were women. There's one video I'm going to share with you. Gentleman talks about these really powerful role models in Africa that were women taking on roles that we expect men to fill, generally. And one example of this is in the Mali Empire, which was Muslim, about 700 years old, 600 years ago, right around there. There was a woman whose name was Amina, and her father, she was his best, brightest, and only child. And he trained her he made sure that she was trained in everything from the courtly expectations of women. And we're talking about 14th century or so, courtly expectations of women, and also the martial expectations of men. And so she could dazzle people by her mere presence and her capacity to talk or sing or dance, talk on any subject, dance to, with supernal grace. And but she also knew the martial arts and swordsmanship and could clean the clock out of everybody in the military, any ranking official in the military. She could beat the snot out of them with a sword, using the sword. And she became, for Muslims in northwestern Africa, there's several communities that look at her as kind of the saintly figure of ideal femininity, a woman who is calm, capable, and ultimately can beat the snot out of somebody. And that's just one example. And that's not what we necessarily expect as Westerners looking on this. Traditional roles, a lot of the times, men would be the ones who carved wood, for example, and made spirit masks. The prevailing religious practices look a lot like our expectations of shamanism, for example, and animism. Shamanism is a Navajo friend of mine, or then a friend of mine said that it's more like a reality engineering. But we see these masks that are beautifully made from Africa, and we'll look at a couple. But the masks were generally used as part of these shamanist or animist or ancestor reverence practices, where the person would don the mask and then transform into whoever the mask represented. And then whoever the mask represented, their presence would be there for the ceremony or the ritual or the practice. These masks could represent men or women, people or animals, but they, in many communities, they were traditionally carved only by men. Look at clay work. In many communities, the woman would take on the role of the Penelope, and the man would take on the role of the Ulysses or the Odysseus, where that means the man would be the one to leave the home and interface with the outside world. That he would be the one generally to hunt He would be the one generally to tend fields and cattle. And the woman's role would generally be to be the manager of the homestead. You know, she'd be the one to defend the property. She'd be the one to take care of everything within the family walls. And so things that like clay work was generally something that a woman would work with. So pottery and things like that. In the West, we expect things to be like weaving and cloth. We expect that generally to be something, or that women might do. And particularly in Ghana, there's a tradition of the kente cloth, which is something that is only done traditionally by men. It's essentially the Ghanaian equivalent to the coat of arms that the Europeans had developed, roughly about the similar time frame. And it represented something that was traditionally a masculine endeavor. So that there are some things that are familiar and some things that are not. And of course, I'm generalizing quite a bit. And I wanted to look at some, or show you some artwork. Let's see if I can pull this up here. Okay. I'm having a little bit of a problem with my computer, and I'm not entirely sure exactly why. So if some of the stuff, if I'm talking about it and it's not showing up, it will be present in your in the module. But this page, Britannica has a lot of incredibly cool stuff on it. But I wanted to show you just a couple things. There's a video about the Dogon dancers. And again, these are dancers that could, in the ceremony, either be representing masculine or female or feminine entities, or they could be representing humans or animals. And generally, those masks are going to be carved by men. And I wanted to look at a couple things. This is something that is done traditionally by men. Men design it, men build it. I'm hoping that you can see this. This is an iron icon or image of a being. This is the head. It looks to me like the head of a woman. The reason why I'm saying that is because of the traditional hairstyle, the larger eyes. But this chin, it may very well be that this is actually a man, and that this is a warrior's headdress instead of a traditional feminine hair. Because it could be a chin, but it could also be a beard. And and we run this sometimes we run into occasionally, where it's difficult to make out all the gender identifiers because this isn't my culture. This looks like a masculine figure. Yes, it is. It's a king. Here's a figure. This is a figure of these are two individuals, and I'm going to say they have the woman's traditional hair. They don't have that forward jutting chin, so I'm thinking that was a beard in the other one. And they do have the breasts, so these are women figures, feminine figures. And there's no bones made about the gender identifiers in many of these sculptures. It is incredibly obvious. Sometimes there'll be phalluses on men that are really, really, really apparent, and sometimes there'll be breasts on women that are incredibly apparent. And we can look at several different kinds of artwork, lots of different kinds of techniques. This is a human figure, but because there are not feminine gender indicators on the chest area, there's probably a good chance that it's masculine. This is a Madonna and child figure. I mean, that was, we think of the Madonna and child, or mother and baby, as kind of a Western idea, because we think of it traditionally as referencing Mary, the mother of Christ, and her baby, the infant Jesus. But the Madonna and child, because of the veneration many African cultures had for the process of pregnancy and childbirth and child rearing, the Madonna and child idea as a sculptural reference or painting reference is prevalent throughout a lot of African history. The oldest image in the world, I think, of the Madonna and child figure is actually a sculpture of, I think it's Isis, an Egyptian sculpture, and it's like 5,000 years old. Now, you'll see things like this. This is a masculine figure. This is, it's called a power figure. You'll see there's a lot of spikes and nails and things in it. It looks like the person is suffering, and chances are it does not represent a specific person. A lot of the times when figures like this are made, they were made by male witches. And the male witch, you would go and you would ask them to drive something to punish somebody who has wronged your family or you, or shorted you in a trade or some sort of economic exchange. And then the male witch would take a spike or a nail and pound it into the figure who for that moment would represent the person you wanted to punish, or their family, or something important to them. And that is true for a lot of cultures throughout Africa, with the difference being in Ethiopia, because they were Christian for a lot longer than everybody else. When you see a figure like this in Ethiopia, it actually represents, each of the nails would represent a prayer, because it represents a nail being addressed to the Christ figure. So it's, even though this represents a cursing figure or power over somebody, in most areas of Africa and Ethiopia, something visually similar would actually represent prayers being offered. So I think stuff like that is absolutely incredible. And I have a couple articles that I'm going to share with you about traditional art production and what traditional gender roles were in traditional art production. One of the issues that is problematic for that is the fact that gender identity could be fluid. There were many cultures where gender was something that was decided at birth. It wasn't revealed when the baby came out. It was decided. So somebody who physically was sexed as a man could be raised as a woman. Somebody who had been a woman her entire life, finding out that there was nobody else who could carry on the family name, would change her identity so she could be legally a man, and specifically for the needs to continue the family line. And so when we talk about traditional production roles, gender production roles, it becomes a little bit problematic because, there are general observations, there can be general rules, but they are by no means entirely consistent. They're by no means specific to every culture, because Africa is huge. It has a huge wealth of history. And there are some really fascinating things that we can see. I am trying to pull up some really cool stuff that I can show you. I wanted to share a video with you. Having a hard time with sharing videos on this because then it dings the dings the YouTube algorithm, and a hard time getting the YouTube video processed properly. So what I'm going to do is share some things with you, just talk about them, and I will have the links in the module so you can watch them. There are a number of different art historians that have really been of gender in African art, gender roles in African art production, both traditionally and via colonial expansionist practices. And I would really like you to look at those videos where they talk about it. There are a number. There's everything from truly ancient cave paintings, and that's something kind of interesting too. I think I shared with you guys that using statistical modeling based on the occurrence of finger length in large populations of people, it appears that the cave paintings that we see all around the world, 2/3 of them were most likely done by women. And if we look at different aspects of African art, there are some very specific roles that gender plays in many specifics with a culture. And there are other things that are rather unexpected. Like, for example, there are a number of groups. I hesitate to use the word tribes. That is, people in Africa, just like everywhere else, their societies were ruled by kings and queens, presidents, emperors, empresses, things like that, and their cultures were nations. But when colonialism started coming in, I think in order to kind of dehumanize and disrespect the individuals involved, that language changed to chieftains and tribes. That becomes a serious problem because these people were kings and nations. They were not chieftains and tribes. So that, and you can understand my frustration, I hope, a little bit with that. I'm going to share something else with you really quick. That is weird. I wonder why it's not showing up. Oh, here we go. Okay. This is showing up. Excellent. So we need to change our vocabulary a little bit and be aware that we are talking about nations and kings or queens, empresses. At one point, the most powerful person on the planet was a woman in Egypt, on the continent of Africa. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was, her husband died before her son was old enough, she thought, to rule and be his own man. So as everybody was reeling from the death of her husband, she declared herself a man. And you can see in the record of the time that she suddenly appears with a beard and flat chest. She said that for the next several years during her reign as Pharaoh, as king of all Egypt, Pharaoh would inhabit the body of a woman. And then right after that, you see the beard is off and she has breasts like a woman. And that was true until her son became an adult and could rule on his own. And then she stepped down from being Pharaoh. But she was one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history, and at that time, the most powerful person on the planet. But I want you to see some of this art. This is material from the Princeton University's art collection. And we can see some interesting figures here. There's headdresses and things like that. These figures, they might be gendered. It's hard to tell. But this is definitely a female figure. And if we look up a little bit, this is more recent. This is only about 100, 200 years old, but it feels feminine. And these pots, these baskets, we might expect them to be made by women, but there's a good chance that they could have been made by men. I mean, it's not always clear cut as to who would do the weaving and things like that. So I'd like you to check those out. I think there's some really amazing stuff there. And then the Kimball Art Museum had some really great displays about a year ago. And I have a couple of videos from the curator of the exhibit who talks specifically about dualities in African art, as well as gender perspectives and the language of beauty in African art. And I think that those are truly worthwhile watching, and they will be in the links as well. When colonialism happened, you can tell that I'm not really comfortable giving specific gender assignments to different aspects of African art. And you can just imagine the European colonialists who came, their dilemmas, because they're very used to political structures that depended on the genetics of the man being passed down as to who was going to be the next ruler. And they were, for much of the time of the process of colonialism, women were very firmly held. Their expectations held them in place, and it was very difficult for a woman to do anything beyond what society expected her to do. The men were essentially the producers, and the women weren't. And so going to some of these areas where the families can decide on the gender of the child, where masculine and feminine roles, things that were apparently masculine and feminine roles, could be performed by any gender. That people could, when they're adults, change their gender identity. And these kinds of expectations really made particularly Portuguese and English very uncomfortable. And so you can see a transition in the art where it becomes much more obvious that this is masculine and that's feminine, and a significant amount of identity is lost with the people that practice and create the art. There's one of the articles I'm sending you is about a Portuguese observer talking about how evil these people were for not having the expected European gender roles. And it baffles me. There people like that are products of their time. I totally get that. But it surprises me still that people coming into a completely different environment would expect this person or this culture to hold all the exact same cultural perspectives that the new visitor would have. That is incredibly problematic because we are not all identical. We're not all the same. And you and I can see that. We can see that really easily. That's what this class is about. But the people at the time could not. And so when people did not fit gender role expectations, they were punished, and punished rather harshly. Cultural traditions were declared evil, and people were very harshly treated and killed because of defying cultural expectations. I put together a number of resources for you to use, specifically addressing this idea of gender roles during colonist times. And I'm sorry, my computer is not cooperating. Of course, because I'm live, it's awesome. I will have all these things up. But we can see that there is the significant passage of time over particularly 200 years, from the mid 18th century to the mid 20th century, where people are dramatically and harshly treated because they do not conform to European expectations of gender identity. And this, remember, we talked about in ancient Babylon, men wore dresses and women wore pants. I mean, that was just the way it was. And today you get somebody who's, if a Babylonian came in today and went to church, it would make several people uncomfortable because they'd be wearing the clothes that they were familiar with and comfortable with. I lived in Alabama for a little while, and it was very hot and humid. I had a roommate who was Polynesian and taught me about the lava, and I started wearing a lava. They are so nice in hot and humid climates, and it was hilarious to me how people reacted. Here's a white dude wearing a dress. What is wrong with you? And this was way back in the 1980s, so it was a while ago. So when we see depictions of human forms during colonial colonist times, we do see that identity kind of shifting significantly, and which is really kind of sad. The colonizers really need the population of the people that they're colonizing to not be violent. They need to humble them and accept the idea that colonizers are worth more valuable, something to be afraid of. And part of that process is dehumanizing, and a big part of that process is overlaying the colonizers' cultural expectations onto the previous existing culture. And it's a dehumanizing process that it can be really nasty. And then what is kind of exciting to me now is we look at art throughout Africa, and people are at a point now where a lot of the hurt, pain, and terror has healed to the point where people are able to claim their own identities. So we are seeing a resurgence of awareness that gender is part of who people are. And people who are not European, for example, should not be expected or required to fit European expectations. And so gender roles today, within specifically African art, it's really interesting how people are working to define their own role in creating gender and relating to that. Now, notice I'm talking about gender quite a bit. Remember, we talked about the distinction between sex and gender. Sex is the genetic makeup, and gender is the portrayal. What you are showing to the rest of the world, and two very distinct things. So we talk about gender fluidity. The person's body is not changing, but their awareness of their body is, and their awareness of how they fit into their culture changes. And I'm going to share something with you. I'm hoping I can. Let's see. Oh, yes. Okay, good. All right, I can do it. Excellent. These are traditional African carvings, African material. This particular item is a vessel, and it is designed. Um, I hope you can see it. Yes, okay. It is designed to be a feminine form that cradles or holds something. Now, this is relatively recent. It is it's built in the last 200 years. And so the materials that were used were materials that were common. And many of them are indigenous to the area, specific to the area, but also that blue comes from laundry bluing, which comes from Europe, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And this figure, we know that this is feminine because of the breasts here. And I think that if we apply our semiotics to it, that seems to make sense that the feminine figure would be used to hold something that is important or nurturing. That seems to fit what the role is of it. And this appears to be a prestige item. Prestige means that is designed to be something that could potentially be rather expensive to demonstrate somebody's capacity for wealth or control of economic resources. And I say that because of a lot of these decorations and the additional dye that's put around here. So and this thing is about the size of your backpack, pretty much. That's about how big it is. In other cultures, each and every design is very specific, and that is true of many cultures in Africa. But sometimes designs are done just to be designs, just to attract the eye. But like we talked about with kente cloth, the designs were very specific, had specific meaning. We look down here, and this is a figure. This is about 300, 400 years old, this figure here. And it looks to me, it's basalt, so it'd be very, very hard to carve. But it looks to me like it is probably a masculine figure. It doesn't. With this, we have a prominent head. We don't have a separation here to show hairstyle or helmet. And so because of that, I'm going to say that this is probably going to be a masculine figure. That's what I think. And also we don't have breasts, which are a typical gender indicator. Here, this is odd. It looks to me like it is supposed to be, a saint, a male saint, and it is. It's a carving of Saint Anthony by a male artist. I think this is indicative of both not cultural appropriation, because cultural appropriation, when symbols of a culture are taken unasked, there's an implication that the person who is not asking and taking is in a position of power to do so. So this would not be an example of cultural appropriation. This would be probably an example of cultural indoctrination, where a person is expected to adopt or adopt cultural adoption, where the individual is expected to adopt and partake in cultural traditions of the colonizing force. And this is a pretty small figure. And here we look, this is a figure, we can look at this figure and identify it as female because of the prominent breasts. There's almost no other identifying features about it. This is the Dogons were a group of people in Mali, and they have a visual tradition that is really very striking. It's these figures remind me an awful lot of Picasso's figures, particularly when he does women figures in his Cubist paintings. He will. It feels to me like he has some references, visual references to the Dogon art, and that is not coincidental. He was shown, or he came across African art from Africa, while he and Brock were living together and developing what became Cubism. So I think that there is an argument to be made that this influenced Picasso in his Cubism. Now, these wood carvings and stone carvings, a lot of the times they were done by the male artisans as well. I thought that this was a really interesting statement. One of the beliefs is that women, if they were carving during menstruation, or if they were carving wood, then they could become infertile. But also, there's an awareness of intent and process when making sacred objects. And so if a woman has her period while she was creating a sacred object, it would completely destroy the sacredness of the figure itself. And so that's one of the reasons why, even in these intensely religious things that were intended to, for example, to help women to be fertile, a woman would not be the one carving it. And this is a very traditional thing, but this we're coming up to a point where it's starting to change as the culture is really being indoctrinated, as cultures are being indoctrinated. Before this time, while the horrible, despicable slave trade was active, people were dehumanized to the point where they became chattel, and they were worth less than goats. And I think that during that process, a lot of people in Africa were able to, I don't know, they were so thoroughly dehumanized that I don't know how much of what they produced even represented personal identity. I don't know. I can't speak to that at all. But after the slave trade stopped, it is really interesting to see how items are created in different ways, reflecting that kind of relationship with other elements of humanity. Along the western coast during the heyday of whaling, along the western coast of Africa, there were people that were sailing from Europe that were not colonizers. They were whalers, chasing whales around. This is in the 18th and 19th centuries. Artwork. This is not an example of that, but there would be women in these port towns who were whalers' wives. They were the women, Black African women, that the Portuguese and English sailors would come to, and while they were in port, they were their wives. And these guys made enough money. These whalers made enough money that they could keep these women taking care of them and their families during the time that they were whaling and sailing around the world and going, back home to Europe. And the artwork at that time was designed to be something that a lot of the wealth that these women had, they could carry with them. So it was really incredible jewelry. It was an example of artwork at that time. And I'm talking about that because this kind of detailed work reminds me of a lot of that kind of work, and it's from about the same time period. And again, this is done as by male artists. And we have an example of a really old Ethiopian coin. I think this is fascinating because even though it has the Ethiopian script, it looks very much like Greek and Roman coins, which is one amazing to me. I have no explanation for that other than Ethiopia was actively trading with other cultures in the Mediterranean at this time. And then we're talking about lost wax casting, which all of you guys know about already. I do think it's fascinating when we look at some of this stuff that is 500-600 years old. We want to assume that other people who did not produce stuff that looked human or realistic, that they didn't know any better. But it is obvious to me to see from some of the masks that were done really anciently and even more to the present, they were very realistic. And they were specifically designed to be very realistic. But when the mask portrayed somebody who was not necessarily a human, somebody who represented a spirit that was not connected to the human realm, like somebody who was not necessarily an ancestor, then that's when the mask became quite different. But then also masks carried features like if somebody is supposed to be, if the mask is portraying somebody who's a ruler, then the head would be longer. The features would be more pronounced. Different aspects of the features would be more pronounced to demonstrate the capacity of the individual who's being portrayed. So, people, they knew what they were doing, very specifically and very clearly. They knew what they were doing. Now, many people who worked with clay were women, because this is something that I said that the women were basically the stronghold managers, while the men went out and about. And the clay, sometimes they would have potter's wheels. Sometimes most often, or a lot of times they wouldn't. They did coil and slab pottery. And some of this work is astounding. Many times it would be fired, sometimes it wouldn't be. And so you'd have kind of a dried terracotta rather than fired terracotta. And it is interesting to me that there are some spiritual implications, spiritist implications, according to who made the pot and what the pot was used for. And we can talk about semiotics if we'd like to at some point. And you can see some of the pottery was rather plain, but a lot of it has these incredibly beautiful, detailed designs on it. Sometimes the designs meant something very specific, sometimes they didn't. Now, if it's a ritual pot, well, then the gender of the potter might be a little bit up for grabs, but most of the time, the women were the ones who worked with clay for those kinds of things. Now, here it mentions that a few cultures are exceptions to the female potter rule. Hausa men, the Congo, Dogon, Mossi, and Cameroon, those cultures had both male and female potters. But for the most part, it was women that worked with clay. Now, the sculpture is interesting because anybody can do the sculpture. But again, if you have this kind of shamanist culture, and the religion is not shamanism, it's called ATR, or African traditional religion. It's a rather complicated set of beliefs where deities represent rather humanized aspects of the universe, like forces of the universe, and these deities have developed their own identities over time that are really quite powerful. There are many religions that have multiple deities, where the deities represent facets of the same God, but these are very separate individuals. And in many of these religions. But again, if it is going to be a ritual vessel or a ritual object for something specific, then the gender of the creator of that becomes important. We talked about if it is an object that is specifically used for treatment of people that are sick or breaking curses or protecting a home, then it can't, or as an offering, it can't be made by somebody who is dealing with her period. And sometimes it can't be made by a woman, for example. And that's not because she's weaker. It's because of the awareness of how energies flow. And in the West, we simplify that way too much by using the word magic. Now, this is an interesting one because, we talked about that. This was a royal portrait, and it was made by a woman. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Royal portraits in Europe were almost inevitably made by men. I think this is particularly beautiful. This feels to me very feminine. Oh, this is Ife. I believe the Ife culture was in Nigeria, and they were one of the most advanced societies that anybody has seen. I mean, it's incredible. It's amazing that we don't know more about them. But I think a lot of that is because this stuff is so astounding that people just couldn't believe, the colonizers could not believe that it existed. But this is almost 1,000 years old. And what I want you to look at on this, it is very obviously a woman, a beautiful woman. This, I think, represents her hair. And some of the things I want you to think about this is look at the detail and the anatomical aptitude of the person who's doing this. It is obvious that this person is creating something that is very naturalistic, and this is probably exactly what this person looked like. It's after the order of those Greek and Roman busts that we see all over Europe. This is somebody who did very naturalistic portraiture. And the reason why that's important, again, is because we expect that cultures that don't use materials the same way we do, or the cultures that portray human forms differently than we do, don't know how to portray them properly. And I'm using air quotes. When it's obvious that from this artist and from this artist up here, these artists were able to produce stuff that was, this is less naturalistic and it's more recent. This is a lot more naturalistic and it's about 1,000 years old. It's obvious that they knew what they were doing. So when they make artistic choices that lead them away from factual human depiction, then it's a choice made on purpose. And some of this talks about architecture and construction of different buildings and things like this. This is this is quite a bit more recent. This picture was taken about 15 years ago. And we can look at different things like that. But I wanted to come back to here. This is about 3,500 years old. And this is in South Africa. It looks very much like the Lascaux Cave cattle paintings. And, this critter in here, you could identify the species because it is naturalistic enough that you can do that. What is interesting to me is that, again, a lot of these cave paintings, about 2/3 of them at least, were done by women. I think that's absolutely fascinating. So this is a Nigerian weaver, and she's a woman, but same time period, you go over to Ghana, and the person who's weaving is going to be a man. Oh, and this is interesting. This is an image from about 100 years ago, only from recently, where a man is doing the weaving. And since he's outside of Ghana, that's kind of interesting. This idea of stamping designs is a really old decorative technique, and sometimes the designs would be stamped with natural dyes that would be dissipate, and sometimes they would be stamped with material designed to block the dye. So some of these, um, it just depends on what technique is used. What I like about this is that the reason why this white looks the way it does is that it's talking about how it's stitched tightly before dyeing in order to resist the indigo. So essentially, this is basically a tie-dye pattern where the tying, the stitching compressed the material enough that the dye could not get into it. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And this is done by a man. So, men are doing stitching and dyeing and weaving work as well. It's interesting to me that this is a loincloth and it was designed and constructed by a woman artisan. If you guys wanted to, if you guys would like to, for one of your projects, feel free to. There's a movie called the Woman King, and it is about one of these communities in Africa that resisted the colonizers, and it is a true story. There were several women generals that beat the snot out of colonizers, and the colonizers had to turn their own people against them in many cases in order to win. Now, the videos that I want to share with you for the more contemporary gender discussions in modern art from Africa, they are copyrighted, so I can't put those on our YouTube video. So I'm going to attach those, and there we go. I'm going to attach those into the module so you guys can watch those. Now, there's going to be an awful lot of videos on this, and you don't need to watch all of them. I would say go through, find the things that grab your fancy, and watch them. Now, I also wanted to talk about projects. There's going to be another project. I'm going to release 2 more before the end of the semester break. And if you get both of them done, that's great. I only expect actually 1 to get done. But if you get both of those done, the one that you get is going to be added to your grade. But if you don't get the second one done, it's not a big deal because it won't be taken away from your grade. So again, you do the best you can project-wise, and I will get everybody's stuff graded in the next week and a half. So again, I'm sorry for the delays. Computers work absolutely wonderfully when they work, and sometimes the user interface, sadly, is not as capable as one might hope. But go through this material that I'm sharing with you, and spend the next couple days finding stuff that is interesting to you. I would definitely read the articles because they point out some really good things. And remember too that our Western concept of gender and the stability of gender identity is something. It's dissipating, it's changing today, but if you can imagine 200 years ago, the colonizers coming from Europe had this very strong idea of gender identity and confronting society where genders could be fluid and fluidly expressed. It's not always the same. Um, Men and women could both have masculine, traditionally, according to European expectations, traditionally masculine and feminine roles. Artisans, when uh, the gender of the creator of an object was important for the spiritual use, for example, of the object. Things like that. I imagine that those colonizers, it could be very unsettling. So remember that as we look at this, and try to be very aware of where your culturally driven expectations intersect the different reality. Uh, Today in Africa, people well, I'm going to say still, but they are returning to this idea of finding their own identity, because I think it's just recently one of the last colonized countries was finally able to free themselves of French rule, and this happened just in the last 10 years. So this is a country that has been ruled by outsiders for literally generations, and just now people are reclaiming their full humanity. And so in the arts, there's a lot of really exciting stuff that's going on right now where people are expressing their own adoption of understanding about gender identities through all sorts of different kind of media. And I'll have a number of different videos for that as well. And there's a really good TEDx talk where a gentleman from Africa talks specifically about, to a Western audience, unexpected gender roles of African women. So make sure you watch that as well. And again, it's all going to be on in the module. And that module should be up either on tonight, or if I'm having issues with it, tomorrow. All right. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week and a terrific weekend. And I look forward to visiting with all of you. Well, next week is going to be a little bit different because I think we have semester break. And in that case, I will have one of these done and recorded beforehand. And so I will publish it, and then you can watch it anytime you want to during the semester break. That sounds evil, but maybe the Monday after the break or even the Tuesday before. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week and weekend, and be safe, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.